June 6, 1944. Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy, France. The Dakota C-47 shuddered violently as flak burst around it, illuminating the night sky over the Cotentin Peninsula with angry orange flowers of death. Inside the fuselage, 23 paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces blackened with burnt cork, eyes fixed on the red light above the jump door. Staff Sergeant Michael Torino gripped the static line attached to the overhead cable, feeling the coarse webbing cut into his palm through his glove. At 32 years old, he was among the oldest men in the stick, a veteran of Sicily and Salerno who carried the weight of experience like additional equipment strapped to his body. The jump master, Lieutenant Harrison, stood by the door, one hand braced against the frame as the aircraft bucked and rolled. Behind Torino sat Private First Class Danny Kowalski, 19 years old, from Milwaukee, making his first combat jump. The kid had been talking non-stop for the past hour over England, chattering about his girl back home, about the baseball season, about anything to keep the fear at bay. Now he was silent, and Torino could feel him trembling through the press of bodies in the narrow fuselage. 30 seconds. Harrison shouted over the roar of engines and wind. Torino checked his equipment one final time. Main chute, reserve, rifle case strapped to his leg, grenades, ammunition, rations, entrenching tool, gas mask he knew he'd probably never use. Nearly 80 pounds of gear that would make him helpless if he landed in water. They'd been briefed about the flooded fields the Germans had created by damming the Murderet and Douve rivers. Thousands of acres of Normandy farmland now lay under 2 to 4 feet of water, invisible death traps in the darkness below. The red light switched to green. Go. 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 Harrison slapped the first man on the shoulder and the stick began shuffling forward, each paratrooper disappearing through the door into the screaming darkness at intervals of less than a second. Torino counted them out by habit, a shepherd watching his flock leap into the abyss. 15, 16, 17. The aircraft lurched hard to the left as another flak burst detonated close enough to pepper the fuselage with shrapnel. 18, 19. Then he was at the door and Harrison's hand struck his shoulder and there was no more thinking, only the training that had been drilled into him until it became instinct deeper than thought. He jumped. The prop blast hit him like a physical blow, spinning him sideways. He counted, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, felt the opening shock as the static line deployed his main chute, the violent jerk upward as the canopy filled with air. Then silence, relatively speaking, just the whisper of silk above him and the distant sounds of battle below. Tracers arced lazily across the sky, deceptively slow from this height, and he could see fires burning in several locations. The church steeple of Sainte-Mère-Église stood silhouetted against the flames, exactly where it should be according to the briefing maps. But he was descending too fast, and wrong. The wind was carrying him north, away from the planned drop zone. Below, he could see the pale gleam of water reflecting firelight. One of the flooded areas. He pulled hard on his risers, trying to steer away from it, but the wind was too strong and his forward speed too great. The water rushed up at him and he barely had time to hit his quick release and take a breath before he plunged into darkness. The cold was shocking, even through his uniform. He went under completely, weighed down by his equipment, and for a terrible moment he thought he would die right there, drowned in a Norman field before firing a single shot. But his boots found bottom, soft mud that yielded under his weight, and he pushed upward with desperate strength. His head broke the surface and he gasped for air, treading water, or rather standing in water that came up to his chest. Around him in the darkness, he could hear others, coughing and splashing. Someone was screaming for help, the cries becoming weaker. Torino struggled toward the sound, moving through the water in slow motion, his waterlogged equipment dragging at every movement. He found the man 15 yards away, just the top of his helmet visible above the surface. The paratrooper had landed in deeper water and his chute had failed to release, the wet silk dragging him down like an anchor. "Hold on!" Torino shouted, reaching for the man. His fingers found the harness and he pulled, trying to lift the struggling soldier higher. In the faint light, he could see it was Kowalski, the kid from Milwaukee, his eyes wide with terror above the waterline. "Can't breathe," Kowalski choked out. "Can't get it off." The release mechanism had jammed, probably damaged in the landing. Torino pulled his trench knife from its sheath, fumbling with cold-numbed fingers. He had to cut Kowalski free, had to sever the risers holding him to the waterlogged parachute. But as he raised the knife, another sound reached him through the darkness, closer than before. German voices, sharp and commanding, coming from the direction of solid ground perhaps 50 yards away. Flashlight beams swept across the water, searching. Kowalski heard them too. His eyes locked with Torino's and understanding passed between them in that instant. If Torino stayed here, working to cut the tangled harness in the dark, the Germans would find them both. The splashing, the struggling, Kowalski's labored breathing, all of it was drawing attention like a beacon. Already, one of the flashlight beams was swinging in their direction. "Go," Kowalski whispered, the word barely audible. "Sergeant, you gotta go." Torino knew the tactical calculus. One man might slip away in the darkness, moving quietly through the flooded field to reach the tree line beyond. Two men, one of them struggling and gasping, would certainly be caught. And captured paratroopers were often shot on sight in Normandy, the Germans nervous about saboteurs and assassins. The mission was clear, drummed into every man who jumped tonight. Reach the objective, secure the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, prevent German reinforcements from reaching the landing zones where thousands of infantry would be coming ashore at dawn. Every paratrooper who failed to reach his objective weakened the entire operation. But Danny Kowalski was 19 years old and terrified of dying alone in the dark water of a French field. "I'm not leaving you," Torino said, and began sawing at the first riser with his knife. The webbing was thick and waterlogged, resistant to the blade. He worked frantically, cutting through fiber by fiber while Kowalski tried to keep his head above water. The German voices grew louder, more urgent. They'd spotted the movement. A shot cracked out across the water and something splashed nearby. Torino kept cutting, finished the first riser, started on the second. "Halt! Hand hawk!" The flashlight beam found them, pinning them like insects. Torino looked up to see 3 German soldiers at the edge of the water, rifles raised. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. Then Kowalski made the decision for both of them. He grabbed Torino's wrist, the one holding the knife, and pulled it away from the riser. "I said go," Kowalski said clearly, calmly, no longer afraid. "That's an order, Sergeant." A private couldn't give orders to a staff sergeant, but they both knew it didn't matter anymore. Kowalski pushed Torino away, hard, sending him stumbling backward through the water. The movement broke the spell. The Germans opened fire and Torino dove, going under, swimming as well as he could with all his gear still attached, away from the lights and the shouting and the sound of bullets slapping into water. He didn't surface until his lungs were burning, and when he did, he was 20 yards away, hidden by darkness and a slight rise in the flooded ground. Behind him, the shooting had stopped. The flashlight beams were concentrated in one spot now, and he could see them dragging something from the water. He couldn't tell if Kowalski was alive or dead. He wanted to go back, wanted to empty his rifle at those lights, but he forced himself to turn away and begin moving toward the distant tree line. It took him 40 minutes to cross the flooded field, moving slowly and carefully, stopping whenever he heard voices or saw lights. Other paratroopers were scattered across the area, most of them as lost and disoriented as he was. He found 2 men from another stick huddled in the shadows at the base of a hedgerow, collecting themselves. Neither knew where they were. The drop had scattered the 82nd and 101st Airborne across miles of Norman countryside, mixing units and separating men from their officers and objectives. But Torino had jumped in Sicily and Salerno, had learned to navigate by stars and terrain features, and he had studied the maps of Normandy until he could see them in his sleep. He oriented himself by the church steeple and the pattern of roads visible in the firelight, and realized they were nearly 2 miles north of their intended drop zone. The causeway they were supposed to secure, exit 4 leading inland from Utah Beach, was to the south. "We're going this way," he told the other 2 men, pointing. "Stay close and stay quiet." They moved through the Norman hedgerows, those ancient earthen walls topped with dense thickets that divided every field into a separate fortress. Progress was agonizingly slow. Each hedgerow had to be approached carefully, checked for German positions, crossed in a rush that left them exposed and vulnerable. They collected more stragglers as they went, lost paratroopers who attached themselves to anyone who seemed to know where they were going. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, Torino had gathered 15 men, a mongrel squad drawn from 4 different companies. They reached a farmhouse just as dawn was breaking, finding it occupied by a section of German infantry who were as surprised by the sudden appearance of American paratroopers as the Americans were to find them there. The firefight was brief and savage, fought room to room in the pre-dawn darkness, decided finally when one of Torino's men threw a grenade into the kitchen where the Germans had fallen back. When the smoke cleared, 3 Americans were wounded, 6 Germans were dead, and the rest had fled. In the farmhouse, they found maps and documents that confirmed their location. Exit 4 was less than a mile away, across open ground that would be suicidal to cross in daylight. But they could also see, through the farmhouse windows, the first elements of the amphibious assault beginning. The sky to the east was full of ships, more ships than any of them had imagined could exist, and the distant rumble of naval gunfire was a continuous thunder that shook the windows in their frames. "We can't wait for dark," said Corporal Henderson, one of the men Torino had collected. "The infantry will be off those beaches in a few hours, and if we haven't secured that causeway, they'll be sitting ducks." Torino knew he was right. The entire invasion plan depended on speed, on securing the routes inland before the Germans could organize a counterattack. But he also knew that taking 15 exhausted men, most of them already wounded or injured from hard landings, across open ground in daylight against an objective that was supposed to be assaulted by a full company, was likely suicide. He thought of Kowalski, dying in the dark water. He thought of all the decisions that had led to this moment, this farmhouse, these 15 men looking to him for answers. In training, they'd emphasized the importance of the mission above all else. The invasion was bigger than any individual, bigger than any unit. Thousands of men were counting on the paratroopers to do their jobs, to create chaos behind German lines, to seize and hold the critical junctions and causeways. "We go," Torino said. "Check your ammunition, redistribute what we took from the Germans. We move in 5 minutes." They made it halfway to the causeway before the Germans spotted them. Machine gun fire from a concrete bunker swept across the field, cutting down 2 men in the first burst. The rest scattered, diving for what cover they could find in the shallow ditches and behind the hedgerows. Torino assessed the situation in seconds. The bunker commanded the entire approach to the causeway. They couldn't go around it, couldn't suppress it with their small arms, couldn't call for artillery support because most of the radios had been lost in the drop. But one man, moving fast and using the terrain, might be able to get close enough to use grenades. "Covering fire!" Torino shouted. "On my signal, everyone shoot at that bunker. Don't stop until I tell you." He didn't wait for acknowledgement, just started moving, using every dip and fold in the ground, every bush and stone, anything that might give him a few inches of concealment. Behind him, his makeshift squad opened up with everything they had, rifles and machine guns, creating enough noise and muzzle flash to make the Germans button up inside their bunker. Torino ran in short bursts, diving flat between moves, always moving closer. 50 yards became 40, then 30, then 20. At 20 yards, he could see the firing slit clearly, could see the muzzle of the machine gun traversing back and forth, searching for targets. He pulled a grenade from his harness, yanked the pin, counted to 2, and threw it with all his strength. The grenade sailed through the air in a perfect arc and disappeared through the firing slit. Torino pressed himself flat against the ground and covered his head. The explosion was muffled but devastating, contained within the concrete structure. The machine gun went silent. Torino was up and running before the echo faded, reaching the bunker, pulling another grenade, dropping it through the firing slit without looking, diving away as it detonated. This time, there was no return fire, no movement from inside. The causeway was theirs. By noon, elements of the 4th Infantry Division were moving inland on Exit 4, the men from Utah Beach flowing through the gap that Torino and his improvised squad had torn in the German defenses. By evening, the beachhead was secure and expanding. By midnight on June 7, the Allies had landed more than 150,000 men in Normandy, and the liberation of Europe had truly begun. Torino survived the war. He led his men through the hedgerows of Normandy, across the Siegfried Line, into Germany itself. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Exit 4, a medal he accepted but never wore and never spoke about. When reporters asked him about D-Day in later years, he would tell them about the men who didn't come home, about the paratroopers who drowned in the flooded fields, about Private First Class Danny Kowalski from Milwaukee who died in the first hour of the longest day. The decision he made in that dark water haunted him until he died at the age of 87, comfortable in his bed, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew him as a quiet man who sometimes stared out windows at nothing they could see. He had cut the rope, or tried to, knowing the consequences. He had stayed when leaving would have been the tactically sound choice. And though he succeeded in his mission, though he helped to secure the causeway that allowed thousands of men to advance inland, though he did everything the army asked of him and more, he never forgave himself for surviving when Kowalski did not. The mathematics of war are cold and merciless. One life against many. One man's survival against the mission's success. Staff Sergeant Michael Torino understood these calculations intellectually, had accepted them as the price of command. But understanding and acceptance do not erase the human cost, do not silence the voice of a 19-year-old kid saying, "Go," in the darkness, do not make the weight any easier to carry. On June 6, 1944, more than 2,500 American paratroopers jumped into Normandy. By the end of D-Day, more than 1,200 of them were dead, wounded, or missing. Their sacrifice, along with that of thousands of infantry, sailors, and airmen, purchased the foothold in Europe that would eventually lead to victory over Nazi Germany. The Allied invasion of Normandy was the largest amphibious assault in history, a turning point in World War II, and the beginning of the end for Hitler's Third Reich. The men who fought there, who jumped into the dark or waded through the surf under machine gun fire, who climbed the cliffs or secured the causeways, did so knowing that many of them would not survive. They went anyway, because the cause demanded it, because their comrades depended on it, because the future of freedom itself hung in the balance. Some made it home. Some did not. All of them, living and dead, earned a debt that can never be fully repaid, only remembered and honored. This has been the story of one sergeant, one private, and one impossible choice in the flooded fields of Normandy. May we never forget what they and thousands like them sacrificed so that we might live in freedom. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing to hear more historical accounts. Thank you for listening.